Welcome, everybody. This is Michael Munson with Forge. Thanks for being here today as part of our webinar, Part of the Solution, Gender Integrated Sexual Assault Support Groups. We're excited to bring to you some new information, some new content that I know many of you have been eager to hear more about. We have around an hour of content today, so it's a little bit shorter than the hour and a half, but that'll leave ample time for us to have some questions at the end. As many of you know, we oftentimes start with this slide of welcome and housekeeping. So I just wanted to take a moment to review some of those housekeeping items before I turn things over to Laurie, who's going to be our host for the day. So like I said, many of you who have been on one of our previous webinars or in-person trainings have seen this slide with this wonderful pink-haired picture before. But we want to remind you to take care of yourself, and that can mean a lot of different things. We know that sometimes specific content can be difficult to hear, so if you need to step away or want to come back later in the middle of the webinar or want to come back even later than that, please know that we're recording the webinar and the content will be up tomorrow with a closed caption version up within the week. A couple of other housekeeping items for participation. Today we'll have the use of the chat box. We'll probably do one poll and a couple of hands up times. So be ready and prepared to participate if you feel comfortable and interested. And just to make sure that people can find the question and chat box, how about if folks type in the pronoun that you use into that chat box? I'll just give folks a minute to do that. Excellent. So I'm seeing a bunch of people can find the chat box, question box. Excellent. So keep those pronouns coming as we continue to welcome you all into this space. Perfect. It looks like a lot of you have found it. That's great. So just a reminder too that the PowerPoints are available both in the handout section. So you'll see generally around the right side of your screen should be a little pod that's called handouts. So the PowerPoints are there, and they'll also be sent out during the email that you'll receive tomorrow. One note, if you have any technical problems, Ashley, one of our staff people, is behind the scenes today. You'll also hear Ashley speaking a little bit later, but Ashley will be happy to answer any questions that you might have around technical issues. So it looks like you've all found the chat box, which is really great. And I'm going to turn things over to Laurie to get us going with the content.
Hi, this is Laurie. Laurie Cook-Daniels, I'm glad to have you all here. I noticed that there was a question in the chat box that came up. Someone who said, I'm not sure I have it up because I've only seen one response. And because it is coming through the question box, it isn't visible to everyone. So I did get it. We will have it here. And when we use this feature later, we will read everyone the responses. So you'll all get to see what everyone participates with. So thank you for being here today. We want to say, first of all, that we're grateful for a one-year grant from Reliance, the funding that made it possible for us to do this project. And the original funding did come from the National Football League, so we want to give them credit. I am Laurie Cook-Daniels, the short staff person in this picture, and I'll be leading this webinar. I'll be helped by Forge's other full-time staff, Michael Munson, our executive director, who you heard a moment ago, and Ashley Altadonna, our community engagement and project coordinator. Forge is a trans organization 100% funded to focus on anti-violence issues related to transgender survivors. We were founded in 1994, so this marks our 23rd year. Although we are headquartered in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, our work is national with only limited services offered in Wisconsin. We work primarily with victim service providers. About 75% of our time and effort is spent with victim service providers, and also with transgender and non-binary survivors and loved ones. Two foundational principles guide all of our work. When we engage with both survivors and providers, our first goal is to approach this work through a trauma-informed lens. The second foundational principle, again in how we work with both survivors and providers, is to focus on empowerment through highlighting resilience, building on existing knowledge, and promoting a sense of confidence. One of the ways you can keep up with new publications, newly recorded webinars, and upcoming events around the country is by following us on social media. We have an active presence on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. What we can offer you is both training and technical assistance. We offer one-on-one support so that you can call or email us at any time. We respond quickly and thoroughly. We also host occasional webinars. All of our webinars are archived and available on our website. We provide trainings at national conferences and on-site by organizations that request and negotiate with us. We also have more than 60 long and short form publications on our website. We also provide services to transgender survivors, including our Trans Survivors blog, which is new, referrals, our Espavo project, which takes pictures of trans survivors, sexual assault survivors and their loved ones, and publications, including particularly self-help publications. So for those of you who can find the hands up button or want to answer, there we go, we have a poll, I forgot. Please select either yes, no, or I don't. Have you facilitated an all-gender support group? We'd like to get a sense of who has experience on the call. Okay, so the answers should be up on your screen. About 2/3 of you said no, about 1/4 said yes, and 11% of you said I don't, but our agency hosts all gender groups. Thank you for giving us that feedback. That's helpful. So in the question box or chat box, can you share with us what are some of the concerns that you have heard of or that you have yourself about running gender integrated support groups? Okay, women may not open up in front of men. Clients are being triggered. We struggle with marketing as a group for both genders, the comfort and safety of group members, triggers, safety of the participants from their perpetrators. For our agency, we want to be sure we have cultural competency training, women feeling uncomfortable, other genders being aware of how other genders think, feel, act, the wordings around victim survivors. Agency will have to change the messaging around what causes DV, discrimination of trans people, being able to recruit enough male survivors, selling the concept and value to possible participants, discrimination around non-binary folks, appropriate location for everyone, expectation of a variety of genders only to find out that the group is all female, actually getting male survivors in a rural area to want to come, anonymity of participants. I'm sure there are more, and I thank you for those of you that shared, and I wasn't able to read them all, but thank you very much for that. So now, can you tell me what you think the benefits might be? Ending myths that males don't get assaulted, variety of perspectives, increased access, won't have to turn anyone away, universality across genders, same experiences, breaking down gender stereotypes, acceptance, understanding, shared experience, larger pool of participants, reinforcing that DVSA can happen to anyone regardless of gender, learning different ways of coping, confidentiality of participants, allowing for more gender fluidity, high rate of sexual violence in the trans community, similarity of trauma between the genders, increasing the community of survivors to feel support regardless of gender, providing support for all when there are folks who are both survivors and perpetrators, more visibility to non-female survivors, helping survivors feel like they aren't alone in their experience. These are all great answers. Thank you. We will be offering some more of our own as we go along today. Thank you for participating. So we've just finished introductions and our brainstorm of concerns and benefits. We will also be covering during this time about the project itself, benefits of gender integrated groups, assumptions versus experiences, techniques for building community, addressing differences, and questions and answers. So let me talk a minute about the project. This project started out with an online survey of sexual assault support group facilitators. 97 people answered that survey, and we basically asked them about two things. One was, did they have experience doing gender integrated groups? And if so, could they share some of that experience with us? And we also asked if they did not have experience, what were their concerns about running gender integrated groups? Once we had that data and identified what some of the common concerns were, we held in-depth interviews of the experienced facilitators, and there were 18 of those, and those interviews averaged an hour each. We asked them about the common concerns, and we also asked them follow-up questions based on what they had given us in the survey. So the products of this project is a written guide that will be coming out shortly, training webinars such as this one, and a listserv to link facilitators for ongoing support and growth. That listserv will be publicly announced shortly. We have quoted the facilitators' exact words as much as possible. One reason we have done this is to emphasize that support group facilitation is personal. Each person present, be they group member or facilitator, is an individual with their own distinct history and set of beliefs. Together, their every interaction is unique. It has never happened exactly the same way before and will never be repeated. Much as many of us would love to be told precisely what steps we should take to ensure perfect outcomes, that is impossible. Accordingly, both the guide and this webinar are structured as less of a best practices manual and more as a collection of ideas and experiences from which users are encouraged to draw what appeals to them and will best suit the personalities with whom they are working. So we wanted to review a few of the benefits of gender integrated groups before we got started. As so many of us know, there is so much that can be gained through group support, in addition to or instead of individual therapy, self-help modalities, or other healing techniques. For just a short list of benefits, group support can and does decrease post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms and often shortens the duration of PTSD. Group support can help individuals develop skills that help with their healing from sexual assault or abuse. It can provide community and connection with other survivors, which by itself can be tremendously meaningful for survivors. Group support can also dispel myths by allowing survivors to hear other people's stories, struggles, and triumphs. Groups can obviously reduce isolation due to their very nature of being in the same space with other people. And groups can validate what survivors have lived through and support their healing process, normalizing the steps along the way. As so many of you know, support groups for sexual assault survivors have historically been women only, and usually only for non-transgender women. In recent years, some groups have emerged specifically for male survivors, again, usually non-trans men. It continues to be somewhat rare for groups to be inclusive of transgender women, trans men, or non-binary individuals, as well as non-transgender men. Yet, as we know, sexual assault happens to men and transgender people at similar, if not even higher rates than they do for non-trans women. But we often continue to deny group support to people who are genders other than a non-transgender woman. Forge strongly believes that it is critical for organizations and providers to move towards creating and facilitating all gender support groups for several reasons. Men, transgender individuals, and non-binary people experience sexual violence and deserve access to support services. All survivors deserve the opportunity to benefit from this healing modality. As stigma around sexual assault shifts, more male survivors are seeking services. Likewise, as more providers are increasing their cultural competency, knowledge, and awareness of trans individuals, more trans survivors are seeking services. As the non-binary population grows, and it is growing, more non-binary survivors will be seeking group support. Non-binary survivors, of course, cannot bring their full selves to groups that are limited to men only or women only. And there are also legal and policy reasons that encourage us to move in this direction. Non-discrimination provisions in federal programs like the Violence Against Women Act and the Family Violence Prevention Services Act, and many other federal and state funders and institutions are requiring organizations to offer equal services to people of all genders. You will see many photos throughout today's webinar. Forge believes it is critically important to put actual faces to the stories and data we are talking about. Although most images will not be directly related to specific content, we know that many providers sometimes want to have a better sense of who trans people are. Although photos won't tell you who someone is, we believe seeing their images help all of us remember the humanness of both survivors and of transgender survivors and loved ones in particular. We have permission to use all of the images you'll see today. Most of these photographs are from our Espavo project, which I mentioned earlier, which features trans and non-binary survivors of sexual assault and their loved ones. Many agencies haven't expanded their support groups in ways that are inclusive of all genders of survivors due to some fears, concerns, or projections about what will happen if men and women are in the same group, or if men, women, trans people, and non-binary people are all in the same group. What we found is that the main concerns prospective facilitators had ended up being more myths than truth. We'd like to share with you 5 of the most common concerns, worries, or assumptions many people have about gender-integrated support groups, and also share the experiences of seasoned facilitators who have been running gender-integrated groups that counter those assumptions. Assumption number 1. There is a widely held belief that women will feel unsafe around men. People who work in anti-sexual assault organizations and systems often are exceptionally mindful of being aware of people's feelings and trying to create as safe as possible support structures. Let's look at this assumption that women will feel unsafe around men in support groups by taking a peek at what support group facilitators who do run gender-integrated groups have shared. In reality, gender-integrated support group facilitators remind us that not all perpetrators are male. So a blanket statement that women will feel unsafe around men won't hold true if a survivor has a female offender. That assumption that offenders are all male may also scare away women whose perpetrators were female, who might fear that other group members or the facilitators will deny her experience or stigmatize her. For those people who did have a male offender, being in a group that is created to be safe and structured can be really healing for people, allowing them to see that not all men are dangerous. Integrated groups also allow all group members to see the commonalities of survivorship, which can, in and of itself, be one way to create a sense of safety, unity, and healing. For each one of the 5 assumption and experience pairs of data, we want to share a quote that highlights the positive reality of gender-integrated support groups directly from our surveys or interviews. Ashley will start with reading this quote.
Survivors can be hesitant to engage in a group that includes members of the gender that hurt them, but we've discussed that as an opportunity to communicate about concerns and boundaries and rebuild trust with others.
Thank you, Ashley. A second assumption that is often made is that if groups are comprised of many genders of survivors, there needs to be both a male and a female co-facilitator. The reality, of course, is that there are more than 2 genders. Some support groups always have more than one facilitator, but the genders of the facilitators is less important than their skills in creating a place where survivors can heal, learn, and grow. This quote captures the reality of groups not needing to have 2 genders of facilitators.
If you feel like your facilitators need to represent every single identity of your group members, then you're going to need as many facilitators as you have group members, and probably more, because there's not going to be a complete representation, and because I believe that there are infinite gender identities.
A third common assumption is that facilitators need cultural competency training. While cultural competency training is essential, it's important across many areas. Facilitators who work with survivors will strengthen their effectiveness as clinicians or advocates if they enhance their knowledge about gender, sexual orientation, age, race, class, disability, religion, as well as learning more about trauma, neurobiology, alternative healing modalities, adult learning techniques, and so much more. It's also incredibly important for facilitators to address their own biases or phobias. This is important before facilitating a group, as well as something to be constantly aware of as you facilitate. More important than specific cultural competency training, however, is training on active listening. When facilitators can listen fully and be present without judgment, clients will feel heard and validated. Ashley?
Facilitators have to be open, humble, and well-versed in issues that may come up, and well-versed in people that don't identify the same way that they do.
Very good self-training resources are available to facilitators who want to increase their knowledge. Forge has more than 70 hours worth of training webinars about the needs of transgender survivors on our website, all available at any time. We also have more than 60 publications available as well. Remember that you don't need to record these URLs because we will be sending the PowerPoint to all participants. There are also some good self-training materials on male survivors. Here are 2. One is from 1 in 6, which is a US group, and the other is from Living Well, which is an Australian group. So let's go go back to the assumptions or worries people have about gender-integrated groups and seasoned facilitators' actual experience around these issues. A fourth assumption or concern is that people won't talk in front of people of other genders. This might sound a little like the book Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus, implying that different genders talk differently and don't want to share personal information in front of people who aren't their gender. The reality is, though, that people talk with people of other genders every day. Many people are heterosexual and frequently talk with people of another gender. Others have close social contacts with people of many genders. What ends up being important in a support group context is building trust, which is so essential to deeper healing interactions. When trust between people deepens, individual identity components or differences become less important or even totally irrelevant. Of course, this isn't just about gender. Sometimes people believe they can only talk to or trust people who are like them, which might be about age or race, educational background or economic status, or just about anything. Again, the reality is that people can and do develop trusting and supportive relationships with people who are of different genders, religions, disability and ability statuses, classes, and so many other variables. One support group leader captured this concept with this quote.
I found as long as there is that connection between group members and people feel that others care, that not sharing across genders doesn't happen. They'll share. Once they felt that they were heard and that they wouldn't be judged, they were inclined to share.
The last assumption and experience we'd like to share with you today is the belief that there needs to be more than one of each identity in a group for people to feel comfortable or able to feel included. The reality is that every person has thousands of identities. There is literally no way that a group could be comprised of people who all had many similar identities. What many support group leaders are finding is that sometimes the contrast between individuals in a group can actually help people see how they are alike. For example, in their survivorship, in their resilience, and in their ability to learn skills to heal from trauma. Sometimes being the only one in a group can actually be healing in itself. Here's what one leader said.
A transgendered kid spent a lot of time when they first joined the group trying to convince everybody that nobody understood them. And just sitting down and listening to the stories that other people in the group were telling, they finally looked at me one day and was like, we really are all the same. They finally clicked. It wasn't about gender.
I love that quote. So let's move on to techniques for building community. We are going to cover just a few that may be particularly useful in mixed gender groups. The first is developing community agreements. These are also known as ground rules, and they're known by other terms as well. Forge likes the term community agreement because it reminds everyone that they are engaged in a process of creating a new, never before existed community. They have a responsibility to participate and make it safe for everyone. Developing community agreements is a sort of undercover way to promote responsibility among group members. You can also explicitly give the group responsibility, as this facilitator does.
I like for everyone in my group to know that we're responsible for ourselves and to each other for how this group is going to turn out. I always tell them, I've never done this before. And they look at me like, oh God, this grown-up has never done this before. No, I've led millions of groups, but not with you and you and you today, with what's happening in the world today. You know, every day is new. Every group is new. You might feel this way this week, and next week you're going to feel a different way, and that's okay. That's kind of my take on connecting people and creating safety and building trust.
As you can tell from that quote, some of our facilitators have facilitated groups that were for youth as well as groups for adults, and that was from a youth group facilitator. Another way to continually set a tone is by making values explicit, as this facilitator does.
We can talk about the central values, like an anti-oppression framework and creating an inclusive space for everybody. Then we talk about how that happens. I offer some ideas, but often the group members contribute ideas as well. Whenever a new session would start, we would talk about making it a safe place and respecting each other's experiences. So what does it look like when we respect other people's experiences? What does it sound like? Part of that is pointing out to be really mindful of the language that we're using.
Asking everyone in a group to share their pronouns also helps build community and safety. Here's what one facilitator said about that.
When we start the group and do introductions, we ask people to identify their pronoun. If there are questions, we explain a bit more about why we do that, but we don't make a big deal about it. We now ask people to put their pronouns on their name tag, but some choose not to, and we don't pressure about that. It all seems a bit strange at first, but people are getting used to it.
And finally, most facilitators do it automatically, but it's worth reminding all of us that pointing out commonalities among group members helps build community.
If somebody had shared a story, and then later in the group somebody else shared a story that had a parallel, as long as I felt I knew that people would be comfortable, then I might point out the connection. Oh, that sounds like what this person was saying earlier. Or, I wonder if that's similar to what this person expressed or was feeling when they talked about their situation.
I would like to invite you to share in the question box or chat room if you have other techniques you'd like to share that you use to help build community and support groups. I'm hearing icebreaker activities. That certainly is a good one that many people do use. Community altar. We play 2 truths and 1 lie. I'd like to know more about that one if you are able to. Cultural humility training. Let's see if I can capture this one. Write down regulations for the group if the group will be together for a long term. Weekly check-ins and check-outs. I like to, I'm sorry, these are going too fast for me. Thank you for participating. I like to refer to the group as your group and remind them, members, that I'm just here to do logistics, open doors, turn on lights, but the group is ultimately up to members. Someone has noted when you tell them you understand or know, it feels condescending and makes distance between you and the participant, which is a good reminder that there are also things that help not build community. Another answer is finding common interests. Toss a large stress ball among participants in the group, using I statements, looking at names, pronouns, and a random question to see the personalities in the room. Ask what they would like to take away from the group at the beginning and what they're walking away with at the conclusion. For community altar, we invite people to bring something that is personal to their life or a picture of a person that they want to bring into the room. Oh, here's the answer to the question I asked earlier. We all write 3 statements about ourselves. 2 are true, 1 is a lie. The group members all guess which one is the lie. It's a lot of fun and makes sharing personal info easy. Allowing group members to set topics. So I think I missed a few, but I thank you all for participating. Those were interesting and helpful. So let's move on to addressing differences. There are lots of ways to address conflicts or stereotyping in support groups. We'd like to share first 2 strategies that facilitators said helps them establish a baseline tone for every group meeting. The first technique was to normalize learning.
We start with normalizing and not stigmatizing the process of what happens anytime you learn something is new, so that people feel comfortable with that. One of the things we talk about was how our brains are neurologically wired for comfort. As humans, we tend to be creatures of comfort. So anytime something is new, it's totally understandable and normal that you may have some apprehension about it or some anxiety. Then we talk about how do you make something not brand new and foreign?
The second tone setting technique a facilitator shared that we particularly liked was rejecting binary thinking.
We do a lot of the work on spectrum rather than category. So whether that's talking about safety or even talking about issues related to domestic violence, to not say, here's abuse and here's not abuse, healthy or unhealthy, safe or unsafe. Instead, we present a whole spectrum of what is most safe and what is least safe, along with the idea that things might fall differently in there. We could also do that about respect, we could do that about gender, we could do that with fill in the blank. Having that framework everywhere makes it easier when you have the issues that we traditionally need it the most for. It's not a novel idea when we're talking about being more open-minded or breaking a box about somebody's identity or gender or sexual orientation, because we've gotten away from boxes from the beginning.
Facilitators also need a sleeve full of techniques for handling things in the moment as they come up. We are going to go over a few that facilitators shared with us. One option is for the facilitator to confront or correct something offensive one member says. Here are the actual words one facilitator uses.
I hear some things coming up that could be upsetting, so I want to stop you there. How can you make a statement about how you feel without putting someone else down or making somebody else feel like they're an other?
If a group member stereotypes, a facilitator can offer some counter examples.
One way of doing that would be to say, I've had clients who have described this or people who have had this background or experience. They have often shared that they have a different reaction to that situation or a different experience with that system, or whatever the case might be.
Sometimes group members will handle stereotyping themselves.
If they started to generalize about men and say, all men are this way, or all men do this, I know that some of the other group members will say, well, no, because my best friend's a guy and he's not like that, so I don't always have to jump in.
Other times, a facilitator can explicitly ask the members to handle an issue.
If there's an issue, if there's something someone said that was bothering or upsetting people, or something they did, the facilitator stops the group and says, this is what's happening. I would like the group to decide how we're going to handle this, and then have that discussion.
Another strategy is to shift the group's focus through redirection.
If something started to go off topic or down a road that wasn't related to the group, we tried to just say, I hear what you're saying, but what we're here to focus on is this, and bring it back to that commonality.
Many facilitators try to educate members about differences. We'll talk about a few strategies here. One strategy is for the facilitator themselves to do this.
When a group member, let's say, has a question about certain groups or identities, our facilitators will answer it if nobody in the group wants to. That way, it's not on the people who are attending the group to have to educate others about their identity. If they want to, they can, but usually we end up having to talk about it ourselves as facilitators.
Members may also educate other members. Here's one such story.
One time, a trans guy, so female to male, was talking about his assault. He was talking about how his assailant kept grabbing what he was calling his junk. And this cisgendered male who was in the group kind of had this look on his face. And so the person who was talking said, you know, hey, my junk might not look like your junk, but it's still my junk. But I think he was kind of just open to the quick little piece of education, and then they just moved on.
Facilitators can also choose to follow up with members outside of group. Here's the approach one facilitator uses.
I would also follow up and say, I know we talked about this in group, but group can be an uncomfortable public setting. I just wanted to see if maybe you wanted to talk some more outside of that.
A couple of the facilitators noted that it does not work generally to point members to book-length resources because they won't have time to read them. So here are a couple of short videos about trans people that you may want to have in your back pocket. Remember, we'll be sending out this PowerPoint, so you do not have to write down the URLs right now. Here are a couple web-based resources on male survivors. Obviously, there are other resources on other cultural competency topics, other populations, but it was trans people and men in particular that we were most concerned about in this particular guide. So let's share in the question box again if anyone has other techniques that they've used to address conflicts or stereotyping in support groups. Anyone want to share a technique? Refer back to the ground rules. We have looked at stats and seen who isn't represented and talk about why that might be. In ground rules, we cover the concept of agreeing to disagree at times. Address where the pain and anger is coming from. Discuss positionality. I'm waiting for one more. Is there one more coming? Ah, two more. Hold on a second, please. Have group members look up actual definitions and origins to see what words really mean and or why words and phrases can be offensive. There's a really good set of conversation cards available through nonviolent communication. They address the feelings of one person and the other person identifies the possible values behind those feelings. If members do not let it go, make them hold hands. That is very creative. One person in a group was non-binary, and a cisgender woman said she didn't feel comfortable with a man in the group. And the non-binary person was having a boy day. And we sat and talked about how to handle the situation and why that was offensive. Thank you very much for sharing these. This is very helpful to hear the many different ways that facilitators use to try and help their groups move through conflict. Next slide, please. So, resources and reminders. The guide should be coming out next month, I hope. The webinar obviously is today, and the listserv will be announced fairly shortly. We also have a comment where someone has asked for the name of the nonviolent communication card. So if somebody could provide that, that would be helpful. So before we do questions, let's go to some last words.
All gender groups create wider understanding that this violence can happen to anyone, everyone, and we all need a place to get and give support. I think people feel stronger knowing they can show up for people different from themselves. It humanizes the experience. And one last quote. This group has been, by far, one of the highlights of my role, my advocacy experience. I love facilitating this group.
You will find many resources on our website, and of course that's where we will publish the guide as soon as we get through the processes we need to go through. We're always adding new content. Once again, one of the ways you can keep up with new publications, newly recorded webinars, and upcoming events around the country is by following us on social media. We have an active presence on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can also sign up on our website to be on an email listserv that gets announcements of new products and webinars. So we have plenty of time left for questions or for discussion. So if anyone would like to ask a question, please type it into the question box and we'll try and track them and answer them as they come in. Oh, you probably heard me talking to myself here. There we go. If you look in the question box, we've gotten the answer as to where the cards, the nonviolent communication cards, can be found. Other questions? If making a switch from an all-female group to a gender-inclusive group, are there any suggestions to help members transition? I would say to have an open discussion about what people's concerns might be, what they think the benefits might be, and to talk about whether there are differences in how they want to structure the group to help make it safe for everyone. Someone has asked, how do you retain attendees or incite survivors to attend? One group facilitator that we interviewed actually does call people every week. They meet every other week, so she calls them on the intervening weeks, and she also calls to remind them just before the meeting itself. And she said that that was the way, that constant contact was the way that she was able to keep people in the group. Another question. One concern is whether all gender groups would turn off some potential members. Does anyone offer both options? And the answer to that is certainly yes. And we are all about, I think I'm speaking for all of us on participants as well as presenters here today. We all want to give people choices. So if it's possible that an agency can offer both types of groups, that is certainly going to be helpful for survivors. Someone has asked, any suggestions on facilitating the first meeting of a brand new group? I have this approaching. I do not have suggestions for that, so if somebody else in the participants do, please let us know. Next question, how do you make your invitations comfortable for non-women so they will actually attend the groups they need? What Forge has found is that this is an ongoing and very comprehensive effort. You need to go back through all of your literature and your website and look for where you have mentioned only women or where you have only pictures of women, and start to make it explicit that that your services are available to men. Michael, did you want to add anything to that?
I would just add men and trans people and non-binary people.
Thank you. Next question. I am on the board of a student group, and although we aren't a support group, many survivors come to the meetings. And we have had a hard time showing that we are open to all genders, but we do not have any resources for male victims or trans or non-binary folks. And that is exactly where you need to look, is to start getting some of those resources and making them available and making them very visible. That will certainly help. And there are, Forge has brochures for transgender survivors. 1 in 6 has materials for about male survivors. So that's a couple places to start. Another question, what thoughts or advice do you have around getting other staff on board with gender inclusion? Michael, I'm wondering if you want to take that.
Sure. I think that's oftentimes one of the larger challenges is it's not, the challenge is not necessarily working with clients or survivors, but it's getting, sometimes there's a generational gap within organizations where, some folks are all on board with doing gender integrated support groups and gender integrated services, and other staff are a little bit resistant or fearful of what's going to happen. So, we found that when staff can actually do trainings together, have deep conversations about what those concerns are that some of the staff are having, that can sometimes dispel the myths that some staff are having. We also know that sometimes board of directors are want to squash the expansion into gender integrated groups, and so sometimes discussion needs to happen with board members, which I think a lot of us don't really think of as part of our organizations, but sometimes that needs to happen as well.
Thank you, Michael. The next question, I'm curious about your thoughts on closed versus open groups and if you have a preference. I have seen often that male support groups are closed and require an intake, and women's support groups are more likely to be open. Do you think one is more effective than the other? Forge's groups are always open for a variety of reasons. What we found when we talked to the facilitators of gender integrated groups is that they were successful at both open and closed groups. So I think, as with pretty much everything in life, there are pros and cons to both. Next question. I'm curious about your, that's not the next question. Hold on a moment, please, while I manage my technology.
Would you like me to read the question, Loree?
Yes, please.
So I think the next question is, how would you recommend responding to pushback within one's agency about being concerned about the reaction of cisgender women in the group? Any studies or other participant quotes you could share?
In one's agency. I'm not totally sure I understand the question. I think what in general, what faces us as Americans, a nation that has traditionally brought in so many different kinds of people and fostered religious freedom and fostered other kinds of freedoms, is that in fact we've all got to learn better skills on dealing with diversity across a number of ways. One of the things that we face with the sexual assault programs is that traditionally we've only focused on non-trans women or cisgender women, and we've really just got to start making a little bit different that way.
So another question that I'm seeing, Larry, is how do you ensure the anonymity of group members in small town community? And I'm happy to answer.
I wish I had an answer for that. Certainly you need a confidentiality rule in the group, but it's pretty impossible to have people be in an in-person group and not recognize people that they know. So I do not have a better suggestion for that. Michael?
I think that, it's small communities are often really difficult, and I know that folks that work in small towns or rural communities really have to navigate those issues. And people see each other at the grocery store and at church and in those places. And I don't know that anonymity can really be something that happens, but I think that groups do need to make some agreements about, are we going to recognize each other or acknowledge each other when we're in public and we run into each other, or what are our rules? How do we feel about that? So I think that can be part of that negotiation when groups come together. Would you like me to read some more questions, Lori?
Mm-hmm.
So the next question is, do you recommend screening group participants in advance of groups to make sure closed-minded, judgmental, biased people could be ruled out?
This was also a question that kind of came up as we went through the interviews with the facilitators, and facilitators were successful with both groups that had been screened and groups that had not been screened. So I certainly don't have a recommendation.
Okay. And I'm gonna, some of the questions are kind of duplicating some of the previous questions, so I'm gonna skip through those. So another question is, do you think spending more time on ground rules will help make it more inclusive?
That is one of those questions that has to be answered with, it depends. We have tried to set ground rules with groups of people that just stared at us, where we were just not able to get participation. So obviously, if the members you have in that room don't want to work on ground rules or community agreements, you may have to set it aside and come back to it later on when maybe there's something that happens that provides an opportunity to talk about, if we had a ground rule around this, we would know what to do. In general, though, the more time the group is willing to spend on setting ground rules, the better, I think, unless it gets to be just too crazy. But it's a good way for people to start to know each other, start to know what their issues are, start to know what their concerns are.
And this is Michael. I'd like to add to that, too, that in some of the responses that we had from the survey, as well as in other conversations with folks, we know that a lot of groups review those ground rules at every meeting, or at least reference them, so that there's always this tangential thing that people can refer back to. And sometimes that helps with conflict, because we can just say that, hey, we already talked about that and set that up as a ground rule. So it can help resolve conflicts faster if there's a repeated discussion.
Good. Michael, I have two older questions that I think you've passed. So let me give those. For the facilitators in the study, were these closed groups? How long did they run? Did they have a particular format for the group? And the answer to all of those is it totally varied. We had groups that ran for 6 weeks, and we had groups that had been running for years. And they had very different formats. think this other one is a follow-up saying, should I call people instead of email them? The facilitator that talked about calling said that calling was really useful for her because people were able to say, gee, I'm thinking about bringing up this issue at the next meeting. So it was an easier way to have a conversation. And on the other hand, there were facilitators that worked with primarily younger people who found that texting had to be the way to go.
So another question that I'm seeing is, how would you address a situation in which a woman arrived for a group and discovered that she was uncomfortable with the presence of a cisgender man in the group?
Now, that was something that did come up many times as we put together the guide. And the thing that came up was people should know what to expect. So it would not be a good idea for people to be thinking in their head, this is going to be an all-women group, and show up and find a man there. It's much better to advertise it as an all-gender group and let people know what they can expect.
Great. So there's another question about, is there help for parents of transgender or non-binary teens to help them be more supportive?
There are a number of web-based resources for people, and there are also local support groups in various places. Milwaukee has one, but as far as I know, there's no comprehensive directory. Michael, did you have any more on that?
No, I don't. I'm definitely doing some online research. There are parents groups that are popping up all across the country. Both within trans organizations that are popping up for parents, as well as through community centers. So I think it's fairly easy to find parents groups if you look online for your community. Let me read out another question, and I'm going to skip a couple of them because I think they've already been addressed. Do you recommend structuring groups with activities and topics, or leaving meetings open to less structured conversation between members?
That was also a question that I had, and I can tell you we did not explicitly ask the facilitators that, but in terms of talking to them for an hour about how their groups ran, it became pretty clear. Some groups do in fact have topics that are set ahead of time, and they try to stick to those topics, although occasionally people said, you know, something came up and we did something else. There were groups that decided what to speak about at the meeting based on the check-ins. There were a whole variety of ways that people did things. I will note that something that's covered in the guide but not in this PowerPoint is that a number of facilitators recommended giving people things to do with their hands. So that might be art materials, it might be teaching people how to crochet or knit. Several facilitators found that it was easier for people to talk when they weren't staring at each other, as one facilitator put it.
Another question, and I'm not sure that this is directly linked to the topic of this webinar, but I'll read it anyway, is suggestions for techniques for handling a group member disclosing perpetrator status. And I'm happy to respond to that, Lori, if you'd like me to.
Yes, please.
I think that this is something that a lot of groups have to deal with, and I know some groups have kind of a statement up front about not naming folks, or the okay to name folks, and I think that's part of the ground rules that might be set, or the agreements that are set at the beginning. And I know that sometimes after somebody discloses, the cat's out of the bag, and it's difficult to retract that. So. It might be really good to have those discussions in the early sessions of ground rule setting or community agreements. And if somebody does name a perpetrator, and I think this is especially true in smaller communities where people may know who that perpetrator is, there may need to be some kind of debriefing after that happens, and how do people handle that going forward. So I don't have a really clear-cut answer, but I think that discussion is really important. So like pre-discussion, as well as, if it does happen, how do group members feel about that, and how is it going to be handled within the group, as well as what knowledge people have moving forward.
This is Loree again. As happens frequently with Michael and I heard that question in a different way, which is what should I do when when a survivor in a group reveals that they are also a perpetrator? If it's that question, I have to say that in Forge we just presume that that we have both survivors and perpetrators sometimes in the same person. So I think we would, we are prepared, somewhat prepared, I think, to normalize that in fact some survivors do act out and perpetrate, and the issues are still how do we heal and how do we not perpetrate. Michael, did you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, I did, and thank you for hearing that question differently, because I totally took it a different direction. And if you'd like to clarify the person that asked the question, that would be great. The only other thing I wanted to add to that was some of the research that David Lisak has done. David Lisak, L-I-S-A-C-K, I believe is his last name. And he has done some really great things about looking at people who have been victimized early in childhood generally and go on to perpetrate. So he's really looked at that relationship between victim and perpetrator. So that might be another resource you want to look into. Should we take a few more questions?
Yes.
So the question is, were all the groups surveyed purely support and processing focused, or were there groups that integrated some aspect of psychoeducation? If there were groups that utilized psychoeducation, would there be a recommendation between using purely support-focused or an integrated support psychoeducational form?
There were definitely groups that did psychoeducation. There were definitely groups that did support and psychoeducation. There were groups where I don't have enough data to be able to answer that. I think, again, this is one of those areas in which it depends on the facilitator and the group members what's going to work best for you, what is working, what is not working. So, again, I don't think there are best practices here that we should all be doing it one way. Michael, I have one here that I think we might have missed.
Okay.
I think I would get some pushback from trans leadership regarding having an integrated group as opposed to a strictly non-binary or trans group. Is the answer to just offer both, considering feelings of safety from trans community members? Michael, do you want to take that or you want me to?
Either way.
I will point out that you are probably in a very large metropolitan city if you even have the option of having a trans-only support group. Here in Milwaukee, which I think is one of the 17th largest city in the country, we do not have enough trans survivors to have a non-integrated group. So I think for the vast majority of the country, we're going to need to have integrated groups. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to provide a group opportunity for trans and non-binary people at all. Michael, do you have another one?
I just wanted to add a comment to that too. I mean, I think that just, your example of Milwaukee as the 17th largest city, we certainly do have enough trans survivors in the city to make up a group, but the question is, how to get folks into that group. And so it's just a challenge, I think, for some people to feel safe in whatever setting it is, whether it's an integrated group or a non-integrated group. And, it's really the read of the city. So, let me move on to another question for us. Did you find any relationship between groups that had curriculums and the level of trust or cohesion within the group?
We didn't measure that kind of thing. We were looking for facilitators' individual feedback about what was working and not working for them. So that's a good question to ask another researcher.
How can we support survivors who have family members who do not understand their gender?
Well, that is a really good question. And I'm having conflicting feelings about how to answer that. I do think that you can help members find more resources and find trans support groups that can specifically help them around that issue. I'm not sure that a sexual assault support group can support someone in all of their gender identity issues. Michael, do you want to take that?
I think a lot of times I really appreciate this question because it's a challenging one, but a lot of times the answers to some of these questions are so complicated, and like part of my thinking about this is the family member in the group with the person? Is it a family member that's outside of the group? How close is the family member? All of those kinds of things. And I think this is one of those places where having a multidisciplinary approach is really, really critical. So knowing who potentially therapists are in your area, who work with families that have trans members in them is really important. So you may not offer those services, but somebody else in your community might. And just the ability to be able to connect people to those resources and encourage them to access them might be the one way to help both that survivor, that person, and their family member.
Okay. Someone has offered some advice here that I'd like to share. For persons who are perpetrators and survivors in one, remind the group that sexual abuse is an abuse of power and control through sexual means. So those who survive sexual assault may try to regain that control that was stripped from them in a way that is not condoned, of course, but at least normalizing that desire to reestablish a sense of power and control. I think that's very helpful advice. Thank you.
And one last question that I'm seeing that we haven't addressed already is, do you have any resources for gender-inclusive curriculums?
Yes, actually, I do. There is a book called Warrior Renew, which is about military sexual trauma, recovering from military sexual trauma, and that one is gender inclusive. I can't think of anything else at the moment, but I think there are, and they will also be in the guide.
We're also seeing that a lot of prevention education materials, so not necessarily for support groups, a lot of those prevention education materials are really expanding to be much more gender inclusive in terms of how they talk about healthy relationships and navigating dating and things like that. But that's not exactly about support groups, but it is good to see some movement in that direction about curriculums.
And are people getting the guide? The guide will be put out. We're trying. It's in publication now. We should be announcing it soon, and you should definitely track us on social media if you're interested.
And Loree, could you repeat the name of the book that you mentioned?
Warrior Renew. It's a guide to military sexual assault. And someone has mentioned that the Northwest Network has a really awesome webinar called Thriving While Healing about their skill-based support group for LGBTQ sexual assault survivors. I think that might be it, Michael, and I apologize to anyone whose question we managed to miss. The particular website that we use for these webinars has a few limitations, and we sometimes do lose the questions. Michael?
Yeah, and I just wanted to mention too that we do review the question log afterwards, and if we did miss a question, we will try to reach out to you personally and address the question that you had. So thank you all for your incredible participation today. I know we had a lot more engagement than we sometimes do, so that was really great to see so many of you participating. Like we've mentioned a couple times, the PowerPoints will be sent out tomorrow in an automated email, as well as you can download the PowerPoint directly now from the handout section, usually on the right side of your screen. And we'll post the archived webinar tomorrow, and then within a week, it takes about a week for it to be captioned. So then the captioned version will be available in about a week. So we will let you know when that's available. And we really value your feedback. So when the webinar closes today, there'll be a short evaluation form, and we'd really love to hear what worked and didn't work from you, and any suggestions that you might have. So thanks again for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you on other webinars in 2017. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thank you.